Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The drive from Los Angeles to Lake Tahoe had taken nearly 9 hours with traffic. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, and my lower back throbbed with each movement. I'd never ventured this far north in California before, always content with the familiar sprawl of Southern California's endless suburbs and beaches. But something about turning 32 had sparked a desire to explore, to see what lay beyond the concrete jungle I'd called home my entire life. The cabin sat nestled among towering pines, their branches creating a canopy so thick that dusk seemed to arrive hours early. I pulled my aging Honda into the gravel driveway at 5:47 p.m. according to my phone. I remember the exact time because that's when I lost cell service. The property manager, a woman named Patricia, had left the key under a ceramic frog by the front door as promised. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine sol and something else, something organic and earthy that I couldn't quite identify. The main floor consisted of an open living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom. Every floorboard groaned under my weight, announcing my presence to the empty space. After hauling my bags inside, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. The loft bed looked inviting, despite the musty smell of the quilted bedspread. I collapsed onto it fully clothed, not even bothering to remove my shoes. The silence struck me immediately. No car horns, no helicopters overhead, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just an oppressive quiet broken only by the settling of old wood. I dozed fitfully until approximately 9 p.m. when a rhythmic sound pulled me from sleep. Tap, 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 deliberate and measured, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. My eyes snapped open, pupils struggling to adjust to the darkness. The tapping continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I lay rigid, straining to pinpoint its source. The back door, I finally decided. Someone was tapping on the glass panel of the back door. Probably just a branch, I told myself, though I'd noticed earlier that no trees grew close enough to the cabin to touch it. The tapping ceased after several minutes, replaced by that crushing silence again. I pulled the quilt over my head and forced myself back to sleep. The second day passed without incident. I spent the morning exploring the property's perimeter, finding an old shed with a broken padlock and a trail that disappeared into the forest. Inside the shed, I discovered gardening tools coated in rust and something dark that might have been old oil or blood. I didn't investigate closely enough to determine which. I drove into town for supplies, grateful to have cell service again. The local grocery store clerk, a teenager with severe acne scarring, barely looked at me as he rang up my items. When I mentioned I was staying at the Northwood cabin, his hands paused mid-scan. "That place still standing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, why wouldn't it be?" He shrugged, resumed scanning. "No reason. Just been empty a long time." That night I built a fire and cooked dinner on the ancient electric stove. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly. Front door, back door, windows. Everything secure. I settled onto the couch with a book, trying to ignore how the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to move independently of the flames. Sleep came easier that night. No tapping, no disturbances, just the occasional pop from the dying embers in the fireplace. I woke at 4:23 a.m. to the sound of the attic ladder, a pull-down contraption I'd noticed earlier, creaking as it extended. The ladder was positioned directly behind the couch where I'd fallen asleep, too lazy to climb to the loft. My body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the ladder rungs. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. The air in the room changed, became heavier somehow. I could feel a presence looming behind the couch, could sense eyes boring into the back of my skull. My chest barely moved as I tried to control my breathing, feigning sleep while every nerve screamed in alarm. The couch dipped slightly as weight settled onto it. Not beside me, over me. I felt hands plant themselves on either side of my body, felt hot breath against the side of my face. The smell hit me then. Decay mixed with something chemical, like formaldehyde. A drop of something warm and wet landed on my cheek. Time stretched impossibly. Seconds felt like hours as this thing hovered inches from my face. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, terrified that any movement would trigger... What? I didn't want to find out. Finally, after an eternity, the weight shifted. The presence crawled backward off the couch with deliberate slowness. Footsteps padded across the floor. The back door opened with a soft click, then closed again. I remained frozen for another hour, maybe two, before finally daring to sit up. My cheek was sticky where that drop had landed. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see it was dark, almost black. I stumbled to the bathroom and scrubbed my face raw, watching the dark substance swirl down the drain. When my friends arrived later that morning for our planned weekend getaway, Marcus, Jennifer, and Yasmin, I told them about the encounter. They exchanged glances, clearly thinking I'd had a nightmare. Marcus even laughed, suggesting I'd been drinking too much. "The place is creepy," Jennifer admitted. "But come on. Someone crawling over you? That's horror movie stuff." I didn't argue. What was the point? But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The stain on the couch cushion proved it. A dark outline where something had dripped. That afternoon, we spent hours at the lake. The normalcy of it, swimming, laughing, complaining about sunburn, almost made me forget the previous night's terror. Almost. But as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, that familiar dread crept back. The property caretakers, an elderly couple who lived in a trailer near the main road, stopped by to check on us. They mentioned a river about 15 minutes into the woods, accessible by a marked trail. My friends, exhausted from the day's activities, opted to rest. But I felt restless, needed to move, needed to not think about what had happened in the early morning hours. I grabbed bug spray, a small backpack with water and snacks, and my phone, useless without signal, but its flashlight might come in handy. The trail began just past the shed, marked by a wooden sign so weathered the letters were barely visible. The path was narrow but clear, winding between massive pines and patches of tall grass that reached my waist. Every step took me deeper into a green tunnel, the canopy so thick overhead that the approaching dusk became near darkness. After exactly 15 minutes of walking, I heard the river before I saw it. A gentle rushing that seemed too loud in the otherwise silent forest. The trail opened onto a small clearing with 2 picnic tables, their wood gray and splintered with age. The river itself was wider than expected, maybe 30 feet across, its water dark and moving faster than the sound suggested. I set my backpack on one of the tables and approached the water's edge. That's when I noticed the grass. On my walk here, it had stood tall and undisturbed on either side of the trail. But now, looking back, I could see massive swaths of it pressed flat, as if something enormous had dragged itself through. The pattern was wrong for any animal I knew. Too wide, too deliberate, creating a path that paralleled the trail I'd taken. My skin prickled. I backed away from the river, grabbed my bag, and started back toward the cabin. But the trail had changed. What had been a clear path was now obscured by fallen branches and disturbed earth. The flattened grass formed a maze of trails leading in different directions, each one as wide as a car. I chose what I thought was the original path and walked quickly, fighting the urge to run. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even wind in the trees. Just my footsteps and increasingly labored breathing. Then I heard it. A sound that made my stomach drop and my legs weak. Part scream, part gurgle, as if someone was trying to shriek while drowning. It came from behind me, from the direction of the river, but seemed to echo from all sides. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush. The path was gone, or I'd lost it in my panic. All I could do was run in what I hoped was the direction of the cabin. Behind me I could hear pursuit, not footsteps exactly, but a wet sliding sound punctuated by the cracking of branches. Another scream, closer this time. The sound reverberated through my chest, so loud it seemed impossible for lungs to produce it. I stumbled over a root, caught myself, kept running. My legs burned, my lungs felt ready to burst, but adrenaline kept me moving. The thing behind me was playing with me. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped to catch my breath, the sounds of pursuit ceased. But always, I could feel it there. Watching, waiting, enjoying my terror. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, I saw the bridge, a small wooden structure I'd crossed on my way to the river. Relief flooded through me. I knew where I was. The cabin was just minutes away. I sprinted across the bridge and up the trail. The cabin's lights glowed like a beacon through the trees. But instead of rushing inside to safety, I stopped on the porch. Something made me turn back to face the forest, to confront whatever had chased me. The tree line stood dark and impenetrable. Nothing moved. No sound disturbed the evening air. But I knew it was there, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Watching. Waiting. Tears streamed down my face as I stood there, unable to move, unable to look away. I typed everything into my phone's notes app with shaking fingers, needing to document it, needing proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I finally went inside after an hour on the porch. My friends were watching TV, oblivious to my distress until they saw my face. "What happened?" Yasmin asked, pausing the movie. I told them everything. The chase, the sounds, the feeling of being hunted. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining it into the darkness. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We huddled together in the living room that night, no one willing to sleep alone. Jennifer suggested burning sage, something about cleansing negative energy. It seemed ridiculous, but we were desperate for any comfort. Around 4 a.m., why was it always 4 a.m.? We heard the tapping again. But this time it wasn't just on one window. It moved around the cabin, back door, side window, front window, as if something was circling us. Marcus grabbed his phone and started recording. The tapping had a pattern. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. Then it would move to the next window. We sat frozen in the living room, afraid to investigate, afraid to move. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the tapping stopped. But the silence that followed was worse somehow, expectant, like the calm before a storm. Then the shed. Massive banging sounds erupted from the old shed out back. Not knocking, beating. Like someone taking a sledgehammer to the walls. The entire cabin seemed to shake with each impact. Jennifer whimpered. Yasmin gripped my hand so tight her nails drew blood. Marcus kept his phone pointed at the window, still recording, his face pale in the screen's glow. The banging stopped as suddenly as it began. We waited until dawn before venturing outside. The shed's door hung off its hinges. Deep gouges scarred the walls from the inside, as if something had clawed its way out. But the shed had been empty, except for those rusty tools. We'd all seen it. We decided to leave immediately. As we packed frantically, I noticed Marcus studying his phone with a disturbed expression. "Look at this," he said, showing me the video from the night before. At first, it just showed the dark window with our reflections. But then, in the background, barely visible, a face. Human but wrong. The features were distorted, stretched, like someone had grabbed the skin and pulled. And the eyes. The eyes were solid black, reflecting nothing. "That's not possible," Jennifer whispered, looking over our shoulders. But there it was, in frame after frame, getting closer to the window with each appearance. In the final frames, it filled the entire window, that grotesque face pressed against the glass, mouth open in what might have been a smile or a scream. We threw our bags in our cars without bothering to clean or lock up. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. A figure stood on the porch, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like old clothing. It raised one hand in a mock wave. "Drive faster," Yasmin urged from the back seat. She'd seen it too. I'm writing this from my apartment in Los Angeles 3 weeks later. We made it home safely, though none of us spoke during the entire 8-hour drive. We've tried to return to normal life, but something fundamental has changed. Marcus discovered, through obsessive online research, that the Northwood cabin had a history. 3 families had lived there over the decades. All had left suddenly, refusing to explain why. The last occupants in 2016 had simply vanished. Their belongings were found neatly packed, their car in the driveway, but they were never seen again. Jennifer found old newspaper archives, stories dating back to the 1970s about hikers disappearing in those woods, about strange sounds that drove people from their homes, about things seen moving between the trees that shouldn't exist. But the worst discovery was mine. Going through my photos from the trip, I found images I didn't remember taking. Pictures of me sleeping on that couch. Pictures taken from inside the cabin while I was at the river. Pictures of all of us through the windows, unaware we were being watched. In the last photo, dated the morning we left, 4 figures stand in front of our cars. We're all accounted for: Marcus, Jennifer, Yasmin, and me. But there's a 5th figure standing behind us, tall and thin and wrong, its hand resting on my shoulder. We were never alone in that cabin, and sometimes, late at night in my locked apartment, when I hear an unexpected sound or catch movement in my peripheral vision, I wonder if we ever truly left it behind. The tapping started on my bedroom window last night. I'm looking for a new apartment tomorrow. I first heard about Roberto Yazzi's ordeal from a classmate at Northern Arizona University who pulled me aside after our anthropology seminar. "You need to talk to this guy," she insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. He experienced something absolutely terrifying one night on the reservation. Something that still haunts him. The way she described it made my skin crawl. Roberto had been reluctant to share his story with anyone, but word had gotten around campus about his night terrors and the way he'd jump at unexpected sounds. When I finally approached him, he agreed to meet at a small diner off Route 40, away from the usual student crowds. Roberto was 22 now, but he told me this happened when he was 12 years old back in 2015. He'd been traveling with his father, Vincent, returning from a family funeral in Chinle. They'd chosen to take the back roads rather than the main highway, a decision that would haunt them both forever. "My dad knew those roads like the back of his hand," Roberto said, stirring his untouched coffee nervously. He'd driven them for 30 years, delivering supplies to remote communities. But that night, he paused, his hands trembling slightly. That night, something was different. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the narrow asphalt road. No streetlights, no houses, just the pale glow of their headlights cutting through the overwhelming darkness. Roberto remembered feeling drowsy in the passenger seat, lulled by the steady hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the old pickup truck. Then his father's demeanor changed completely. Vincent's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. Roberto noticed his father's eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, a nervous tick in his jaw becoming more pronounced with each passing mile. "Dad?" Roberto had asked, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Is everything okay?" Vincent didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pressed harder on the accelerator, and the speedometer needle crept past 60, then 70 miles per hour. On these winding reservation roads, that was dangerously fast. "Don't look behind us," Vincent finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Whatever you do, don't turn around." Those words sent ice through Roberto's veins. His father had always been the calm one in the family, the man who fixed problems and protected everyone. To hear fear in his voice was more terrifying than any ghost story Roberto had ever heard. "What's back there?" Roberto pressed, fighting every instinct to crane his neck and look through the rear window. "I don't know," Vincent admitted, and that uncertainty made everything worse. "But it's been following us for the last 10 miles, staying just outside our taillights, matching our speed perfectly." Roberto's imagination began to run wild. Was it another vehicle? Someone with malicious intent? The reservation had its share of dangerous individuals, drug runners, people driven to desperation by poverty and addiction. Stories circulated about travelers being robbed, cars being stolen, worse things happening to those unlucky enough to break down in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truck's engine strained as Vincent pushed it harder. The familiar rumble became a high-pitched whine, and Roberto could feel the vehicle shuddering beneath them. They were driving faster than this old Ford had ever been designed to go. Despite his father's warning, Roberto couldn't resist the overwhelming urge to look. His curiosity battled with his fear, and curiosity won. He adjusted the passenger side mirror, angling it to see behind them. What he saw made his stomach lurch. A figure was running alongside their truck, keeping pace effortlessly even as they approached 80 miles per hour. It wasn't a vehicle at all. It was a person. Or something that had once been a person. The figure moved with an unnatural gait, its limbs seeming to bend in ways that defied human anatomy. Even more disturbing was its attire: tattered clothing that flapped wildly in the wind, torn jeans hanging in strips, and what looked like the remnants of a flannel shirt. The fabric was dark with stains that Roberto didn't want to identify. "Oh, God," he breathed, his voice cracking. Vincent glanced over and saw the terror in his son's eyes. "You looked, didn't you?" he said grimly. "I told you not to look." The figure's head turned toward their truck, and Roberto caught a glimpse of a face that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. It was gaunt and hollow-cheeked, with stringy hair hanging in matted clumps. The eyes reflected their headlights like an animal's, glowing with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. But it was the smile that truly terrified Roberto. A wide, gap-toothed grin that stretched too far across the figure's face, as if the person was experiencing some twisted form of joy from this midnight chase. "What is that thing?" Roberto whispered, unable to look away despite every rational thought screaming at him to turn forward. "I don't know," Vincent repeated, his voice tight with fear. "But we're not stopping to find out." The figure began to close the distance between itself and the truck. What had started as a parallel pursuit became something far more aggressive. Roberto watched in horror as the person, for lack of a better word, began to angle toward their vehicle. Vincent swerved sharply to the left, the truck's tires screaming against the asphalt. The sudden movement threw Roberto against the passenger door, his shoulder slamming into the window with enough force to leave a bruise. "It's trying to get in front of us," Vincent shouted over the roar of the engine. "Hold on." The figure leaped forward with impossible speed, landing directly in their path. Vincent had a split second to react. He jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending them careening toward the shoulder of the road. The truck hit loose gravel and sand, fishtailing wildly as Vincent fought to maintain control. Roberto gripped his seatbelt with both hands, his knuckles white with strain. The world outside became a blur of scrub brush and scattered rocks. He could hear the undercarriage of the truck scraping against something, probably a boulder or a piece of old concrete. In the chaos, Roberto lost sight of the figure. For a moment, he dared to hope they had escaped. that whatever sick individual had been pursuing them had been left behind in the dust cloud their vehicle had kicked up. Then he heard the sound. A rhythmic thumping coming from above them, as if someone was running across the roof of the truck. Each footstep sent vibrations through the cab, and Roberto could see the ceiling liner sagging slightly with each impact. "It's on top of us!" he screamed, his voice breaking with panic. Vincent's face had gone pale, beads of sweat visible on his forehead, despite the cool night air flowing through the vents. He began swerving erratically, trying to throw off whatever had climbed onto their vehicle. The thumping grew more intense, and suddenly Roberto heard scratching sounds. Long, deliberate scrapes across the metal roof, as if fingernails were being dragged across the surface. The noise was like fingernails on a chalkboard, making him clench his teeth and cover his ears. Vincent rolled down his window and stuck his head out, trying to see what was happening above them. The wind whipped his hair wildly, and he had to squint against the debris kicked up by their tires. "Get off my truck!" he shouted into the night, his voice carrying a desperate edge that Roberto had never heard before. The scratching stopped. For a few seconds, the only sounds were the engine's labored breathing and the whistle of wind through the open window. Roberto began to hope again that their pursuer had fallen off or given up. Then a face appeared in the windshield, hanging upside down from the roof. It was the same gaunt visage Roberto had seen in the mirror, but now it was close enough to see every horrifying detail. Deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into his soul, cracked lips pulled back in that unsettling grin, and skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in months. The face pressed against the glass, leaving smears of what Roberto prayed was just dirt. The figure began pounding on the windshield with both fists, each impact sending spiderweb cracks across the surface. Vincent slammed on the brakes. The sudden deceleration threw the figure forward, and Roberto watched as it tumbled off the hood and rolled into the road ahead of them. For a moment it lay motionless in their headlight beams, and Roberto thought maybe the fall had knocked it unconscious. "Is it dead?" he whispered. Before Vincent could answer, the figure sprang to its feet with unnatural agility and began running toward them again, this time with obvious fury in its movements. Vincent threw the truck into reverse, tires squealing as they shot backward down the empty road. Roberto watched through the rear window as the figure gave chase, its tattered clothing streaming behind it like dark flags. "We can't outrun it forever," Vincent said, his voice grim with determination. "The engine's overheating and we're almost out of gas." Roberto looked at the dashboard and saw that his father was right. The temperature gauge was deep in the red zone, and the fuel needle hovered just above empty. They had maybe 10 minutes before the truck would break down completely, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere with that thing still pursuing them. "What are we going to do?" Roberto asked, his voice small and frightened. Vincent reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron. The metal bar felt solid and reassuring in his hands, though Roberto wondered if it would be enough to stop whatever was chasing them. "We're going to face this head-on," Vincent said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you, son. I promise." He pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of running at high speed. Roberto could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears and the distant sound of footsteps approaching through the darkness. Vincent got out of the truck slowly, the tire iron held ready at his side. Roberto wanted to follow, to stand beside his father, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. "Stay in the truck," Vincent commanded without looking back. "Lock the doors and don't come out no matter what happens." The figure emerged from the darkness beyond their headlights, moving with that same unnatural gait Roberto had observed before. Up close, he could see that this was definitely a human being, though one that had clearly suffered some kind of severe trauma or mental breakdown. The person's clothes were filthy and torn, hanging in tatters that suggested they had been living rough for a long time. Their hair was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Most disturbing of all were the person's eyes, wild and unfocused, like those of a rabid animal. "Please," Vincent called out, his voice carrying across the desert air. "We don't want any trouble. We're just trying to get home." The figure stopped about 20 feet away, tilting its head as if considering Vincent's words. When it spoke, its voice was a harsh rasp that barely sounded human. "Home," it repeated, the word seeming to cause it physical pain. "Home is gone. Family is gone. Everything is gone." Roberto could see his father's posture relax slightly as he realized they were dealing with a deeply troubled human being rather than something supernatural. This was someone who had suffered tremendous loss and had been broken by it. "What happened to you?" Vincent asked gently, lowering the tire iron, but not dropping it completely. "Fire," the person whispered, and Roberto could hear the anguish in that single word. "The fire took everything. My wife, my children, my house. I tried to save them, but I was too late. Too late. Too late. Too late." The figure began to rock back and forth, repeating those last words like a mantra. Roberto felt a wave of unexpected sympathy for this person who had clearly been through something unimaginable. "I've been walking for months," the person continued, their voice growing stronger. "Looking for them, hoping they survived somehow. But they're gone, aren't they? They're all gone." Vincent took a careful step forward. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. "But following people at night, chasing vehicles, that's not the way to find help. You're scaring people, and you could get yourself killed." The figure's head snapped up, and Roberto saw lucidity return to their eyes for the first time. "Scared?" they said, and suddenly that unnerving grin was back. "Good. Everyone should be scared. The world is full of terrible things that can take everything from you in an instant. Fear keeps you alert. Fear keeps you alive." The momentary sympathy Roberto had felt evaporated, replaced by a renewed sense of dread. What happened next would be burned into Roberto's memory forever. The figure let out a sound that was part laugh, part scream, and began charging toward Vincent with renewed fury. This wasn't the calculated pursuit they had experienced on the road. This was pure, unbridled rage. Vincent raised the tire iron and braced himself for impact. The two figures collided with a sickening thud, and Roberto watched in horror as they grappled in the glare of the headlights. His father was a strong man, hardened by years of physical labor, but their attacker seemed to possess strength born of madness and desperation. They rolled on the ground, each struggling for advantage. Roberto could hear his father grunting with effort and the other person making those inhuman sounds of rage. The tire iron flew out of Vincent's grasp and clattered across the asphalt, coming to rest just out of reach. Unable to stand by any longer, Roberto threw open the truck door and ran toward the struggle. He grabbed the tire iron and raised it above his head, but hesitated. In the tangle of limbs and bodies, he couldn't tell which figure was which. "Dad!" he screamed. "Dad, where are you?" Vincent managed to break free and roll away from his attacker. "Get back in the truck!" he shouted, blood streaming from scratches on his face and arms. But the moment of separation had given Roberto a clear target. Without thinking, he brought the tire iron down hard on their attacker's shoulder. The person let out a howl of pain and fury, spinning toward Roberto with murder in their eyes. Vincent tackled the figure from behind, wrapping his arms around their throat in a chokehold. "Run!" he yelled to Roberto. "Start the truck!" Roberto didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted back to the vehicle and turned the key. The engine turned over sluggishly, coughed, and died. He tried again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the key. On the third try, the engine caught. Roberto threw it into drive and pulled up beside the still struggling figures. Vincent managed to break free once more and dove through the passenger door just as Roberto hit the accelerator. They drove in silence for the next 20 minutes, both too shaken to speak. The sun was beginning to rise on the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, normal colors for a normal world. though nothing would ever feel quite normal again. When they finally reached the main highway, Vincent turned to look at his son. "We don't talk about this to anyone," he said quietly. "Not your mother, not your friends, not the police. Some stories are too dangerous to tell." Roberto nodded, understanding instinctively that his father was right. But as the years passed and the nightmares continued, he began to realize that some stories are too dangerous not to tell. Some experiences demand to be shared, if only to prove to yourself that they really happened. That's why, 7 years later, he was sitting across from me in that diner, finally ready to let someone else carry part of the burden of that terrible night when they encountered a human being who had been stripped of everything that makes us human, leaving behind only pain and rage and an insatiable hunger for company in their suffering. The most horrifying monsters, Roberto told me as we parted ways that evening, are the ones that used to be just like us. My name is Ethan, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I work as an accountant. Numbers have always made sense to me in a way that people haven't. I like the order and logic of spreadsheets and financial statements, but outside of work, I nurture my passion for the great outdoors. Every chance I get, I load up my beat-up old Subaru with camping gear and head out into the wilderness to unplug from the modern world and immerse myself in nature. This past year has been rough. I went through a bad breakup and have struggled to get my social life back on track. To make matters worse, I made some poor investment decisions and am now drowning in credit card debt, barely making ends meet each month. I've been feeling lost, anxious, and in need of a reset. So when my old college buddies Ryan and Alex suggested a guy's trip to the remote forests of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, I jumped at the chance. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we shared many fond memories of camping and hiking trips during our university days. Reuniting for an off-grid adventure sounded like the perfect escape from my troubles. After a long day's drive north, we arrived at a small rustic campground on the shores of Lake Superior that would serve as our base camp. As we set up our tents, the towering evergreens swayed ominously in the wind, and waves crashed against the rocky beach. An eerie mist hung low on the water. I tried to shake an uneasy feeling as I reminded myself that this trip was supposed to help me relax, not wind me up tighter. That first evening, we cooked hot dogs over the campfire and caught up on life, reminiscing about the old days and discussing where our paths had taken us since. Ryan was now married with a young daughter and worked as an engineer in Wisconsin. Alex taught high school science in North Carolina and spent his summers leading youth backpacking expeditions. As the night grew late and the fire died down to glowing embers, our conversation turned to the strange and unexplained. Ryan shared a chilling story he had heard about these woods. Apparently, the Ottawa people who originally inhabited this land told of strange creatures that roamed the forest, shadowy humanoid figures with eyes that glowed in the darkness. Alleged sightings over the years described them as tall and emaciated, with long limbs and pale skin. Campers spoke of hearing eerie wails and finding unusual footprints outside their tents. The Ottawa called them Wendigo, an evil spirit that could possess humans and turn them into violent, cannibalistic monsters. Alex and I exchanged nervous glances as Ryan continued in a low, solemn tone. The Wendigo targeted people in moments of weakness, those who were lost, hungry, or struggling emotionally. It would stalk its prey, driving them to madness and desperation before finally revealing itself. According to legend, the surest way to become possessed by a Wendigo was to encounter it in your dreams. I laughed off Ryan's spooky tale as I crawled into my tent, but I couldn't shake the ominous feeling it left me with as I drifted off into a restless sleep. Little did I know that his story was a dark harbinger of the horrors to come. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding, unsure where I was for a moment. Pale morning light filtered through the tent walls as memories of the previous day came flooding back. The long drive, setting up camp, Ryan's creepy Wendigo story by the dying fire. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. It was just a dumb campfire tale. No need to get worked up. Unzipping the tent flap, I was greeted by the serene, misty shoreline of Lake Superior. Ryan and Alex were already up, boiling water for coffee on our propane stove. The events of last night felt hazy, like a strange dream. We ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and discussed our plans for the day. A long hike to scout for a backcountry campsite where we'd stay tonight, deep in the forest and miles from other people. As I shouldered my heavy pack and we set off down the trail, the eerie feeling from last night crept back in. The woods felt different than other forests I'd hiked, unfriendly somehow. Towering hemlocks blocked out the sun, casting everything in a gloomy half-light. A low mist snaked between the mossy trunks. The only sounds were our boots crunching dead leaves and the occasional distant croak of a raven. I kept thinking I caught flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. We hiked for hours, pushing deeper into the wilderness. My mind wandered as I walked, ruminating on my problems back home that I was trying to escape. The mountain of unpaid bills, my demoralizing dead-end job, the gnawing loneliness of the past year. This trip was supposed to help me get away from all that, but I couldn't seem to stop my anxious thoughts from churning. As the light started to slant into late afternoon, I realized I had fallen behind Ryan and Alex, lost in my own head. Picking up my pace to catch up, I suddenly noticed that the trail had grown faint. Barely more than a faded line of trampled brush snaking between the endless ranks of trees. Had we gotten off track at some point? A shiver tingled up my spine as I realized how utterly alone and tiny I felt beneath the ancient, disapproving glare of the forest. I called out for Ryan and Alex, but the woods seemed to swallow my words, muffling them to eerie silence. I had started to sweat, my heart thudding faster. Where were they? How could I have lost them? The trail was gone now. No matter which direction I looked, my surroundings were a uniform tangle of trunks and shadow. I was undeniably lost and alone in this vast, primordial wilderness. Ryan's words from last night echoed in my mind unbidden. The Wendigo targets people in moments of weakness, those who are lost, hungry, struggling emotionally. A twig snapped sharply behind me. I spun around and saw a flicker of pale motion between distant trees. Breath catching in my throat, I called out in a quavering voice, "Ryan, Alex, is that you guys?" But only silence answered me. The forest had gone preternaturally still, like a dark, watchful presence holding its breath. I suddenly felt a prickling certainty that something was out there in the shadows, and it was observing me, stalking me. I was alone and lost in the great North Woods, miles from civilization. And I couldn't shake the terrifying sense that the forest itself was alive and malevolent, that I had somehow drawn the attention of an ancient, patient evil. As the shadows lengthened and an unseasonable chill crept into the air, I shivered and realized one thing with sinking dread. Night was falling, and I desperately needed to find my friends before darkness swallowed the woods. Because strangely, I knew that if I didn't, I might never make it out of this forest again. I crashed frantically through thickets and deadfalls, wincing as twigs lashed my face, calling for Ryan and Alex until my voice grew hoarse. But the woods gave no answer. Each towering tree looked just like the last, and I soon had to accept that I was hopelessly disoriented. The meager daylight was fading fast, shadows pooling between the endless ranks of trunks. Overhead, a raven croaked forlornly, and in my agitated state it sounded like mocking laughter. Fear churned sickly in my stomach as Ryan's ominous tale haunted me. When I could barely see my own feet beneath me in the gloom, I had to accept bitter defeat. I was lost, alone, and now would have to spend the night in these unsettling woods by myself, with no tent or proper gear. But I was an experienced outdoorsman, I sternly told myself. I could get through this. All I needed was a campfire for warmth and protection. and tomorrow at first light I'd regain my bearings and reunite with the others. Everything would look better in the clear light of day. Scouring the forest floor, I gathered an armload of deadfall and cleared a small space between the looming evergreens. My lighter was buried deep in my pack, but I eventually fished it out with trembling hands, praying that it would ignite the damp tinder. After a tense minute of coaxing, a weak flame finally bloomed. I carefully nurtured it until I had a modest blaze casting a pool of flickering orange light. The fire's warmth was a small comfort against the eerie night chill settling over the forest. I hunkered close to the wavering flames, feeding it larger sticks, trying to bolster both the fire and my own flagging courage. Overhead, stars glinted coldly in the narrow gaps between the tree crowns. Aside from the crackle of my modest blaze, the woods had fallen preternaturally silent, without even the hum of insects or rustle of night creatures. It was as if the forest was collectively holding its breath in some grim anticipation. Despite my efforts to stay awake and alert, exhaustion from the day's hike and stress wore me down. My thoughts drifted to Megan and our painful breakup, the credit card statements that kept me up at night, the creeping sense that I was wasting my life in a meaningless job. Maybe that's why I'd agreed so eagerly to this trip, a desperate bid to outrun my demons for a little while. But now, shivering alone fireside in the uncaring forest, my personal struggles felt trivial against the deeper menace lurking in these ancient woods, a primordial fear as old as humanity itself. Just as my chin started to nod toward my chest, I heard a distant sound that jolted me to full alertness. A long, wavering cry somewhere between a moan and a howl that sent ice water trickling down my spine. It sounded vaguely human, but not quite. The wail rose in pitch before tapering into haunting silence. The night seemed to darken and press closer around me as my pulse hammered in my throat. Moments later, a second cry reverberated dimly through the trees, further off but no less chilling. Definitely not a coyote or owl. I huddled closer to the fire, now a pitifully small circle of light in the engulfing blackness. My imagination raced, trying to place the unsettling sounds. Could the Wendigo legend actually have some truth to it? Were those the hunting calls of those spindly pale creatures Ryan had described? Did I actually glimpse one earlier stalking me through the trees? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to slow my ragged breathing. When I opened them, I noticed that the fire had burned low. More crimson embers now than reassuring flame. But before I could feed it more fuel, I glimpsed a pale flicker of motion just at the edge of the weak firelight. My blood turned to ice as a gaunt figure stepped soundlessly out from behind a tree. Taller than a man, with skeletal limbs, ghostly skin, and eyes that glinted with feral hunger. I bit back a scream, scrabbling backwards. The creature took another silent step forward, the firelight dancing over its nightmarish frame. There was a hideous, alien intelligence in its sunken gaze, ancient and merciless. I felt the Wendigo's eyes bore into mine, glimpsed the ravenous madness lurking there, and felt my own sanity fray at the edges as I stared into that pale, gaunt face from humanity's darkest folklore. A single thought tolled like a funeral bell in my mind. Now I finally understood the true meaning of horror. I fled blindly into the night, heedless of direction, my pulse a roar of terror in my ears. Bursting through thickets of brambles, clawing my way through snarls of deadwood, stumbling over gnarled roots that twisted like grasping fingers across the forest floor. The gurgling rush of a stream cut off my path, shocking me back to a semblance of rationality as I skidded to a stop, gasping at its shadowed edge. Sobbing for air, my head swiveled wildly, searching for any sign of pursuit. The forest loomed around me, silent and watchful. My campfire was now just the barest crimson smudge flickering distantly between the towering ranks of hemlock trunks. All was still and shadowed, not a pale figure in sight. Could I have imagined that ghastly specter? A hallucination conjured by exhaustion, darkness, and Ryan's ominous fireside story. Logic argued that must be the case. But the image of those feral, ravenous eyes burned in my memory, too starkly lucid to be a mere figment. Deep in my bones, an animal instinct older than reason itself whispered the certain truth. Something was out there in the night, hunting me. Dragging my sleeve across my clammy face, I took stock of my surroundings and shuddered anew. I was now utterly disoriented, more lost than ever in this endless wilderness, and with no fire or proper gear for the night. Fighting down a fresh surge of panic, I focused grimly on the one thing I could control, putting more distance between myself and whatever lurked back there in the darkness. I crashed along parallel to the stream, hoping it would eventually lead me to a lake or river and some point of reference to navigate by. Biting cold gnawed deep into my bones. Unseen brambles clawed at my face, the stinging pain almost welcome for how it distracted from the sickening churn of terror in my gut. As I fought through a knee-high tangle of devil's club, their spiny leaves biting through my jeans, I glimpsed a pallid flicker of motion paralleling me among the trees on the far side of the stream. I froze, straining my eyes in the darkness, unsure whether the silhouette was real or imagined. But undeniably, a malevolent presence, ancient and watchful, seemed to lurk just beyond my sight in the gloom-shrouded trunks, goading me onward, not ready to reveal itself fully just yet. Madness crept at the edges of my mind. I could feel it prowling in the shadows of my own psyche, like the gaunt creature stalking me through the forest. We're all just one bad night away from insanity, I thought wildly. A single glimpse behind the veil of a dark and uncaring universe. Shaking my head violently, I redoubled my pace, forcing thoughts of home and needing to see my family again to eclipse the corrosive despair. I pictured my dingy apartment back in Pittsburgh, ugly wallpaper and leaky faucet suddenly nostalgically inviting. Even my sterile office cubicle seemed like a bastion of sanity and safety, numbers marching neatly in orderly rows and columns. Just then, I stumbled into a small moonlit clearing, and my heart lurched in my chest. A weathered cabin huddled at the clearing's center, boards canted and roof sagging from winters of heavy snow. A rickety porch draped in shadow. Part of me recoiled from the eerie scene, but the desperate need for shelter and walls and something of human origin won out. I hesitantly approached the door, my knock swallowed by the sepulchral night. "Hello?" I called, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is anyone home? I could really use some help." Then the door's rusty hinges shrieked and it yawned open with a drawn-out creak, revealing only darkness within. But as my eyes adjusted, I glimpsed the shimmer of pale, gaunt limbs and a feral glint of sunken eyes. My blood turned to ice as I stared into the face of nightmare, and the horrible truth crashed over me. I hadn't outrun the Wendigo. I had stumbled right into its lair. The Wendigo's fetid breath washed over me, reeking of blood and decay as it loomed in the doorway. Up close it was even more horrific, emaciated yet muscular, elongated limbs tapering to wicked black talons, a nightmare fusion of famine and unnatural strength. This close, I glimpsed the tatters of clothing and realized with fresh horror that this creature had once been human before it transformed into the gaunt monstrosity before me. I turned and sprinted madly into the night, the Wendigo's hissing snarl dogging my heels. I crashed blindly through brambles that bit into my flesh, slicing my face and hands as I ran in mindless terror. The creature bounded after me, effortless and silent as a wolf, the forest's shadows parting like water before it. We danced a morbid waltz through the moonlit trees, hunter and prey, the Wendigo almost lazily matching my frantic pace but always lurking at the edges of my sight. It was playing with me, I realized with renewed horror, savoring my unconstrained terror and desperation. My legs burned and my lungs sobbed for air, but I ran on, primal survival instinct eclipsing all reason. I didn't dare look back. terrified of what I might see gaining ground behind me. Crashing through the underbrush, I focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, on drawing one more ragged breath. But I knew I couldn't outrun the creature forever. Already my pace was flagging, my body pushed past its limits. In desperation, I veered toward where the trees thinned out, praying it meant I was nearing the lakeshore or a road, some avenue of escape. Bursting from the tree line, my heart plummeted as I skidded to a halt at the crumbling edge of a sheer cliff, waves crashing on jagged rocks far below. Spinning around, I searched for another route, but the Wendigo was suddenly there, slipping silently from the shadows to block my path. In the moonlight, I could see its pale, gaunt frame more clearly, all sinew and emaciated limbs. Intelligent, yet inhuman eyes glittered in its skull-like face as it stalked slowly closer, relishing my obvious terror and despair. I was cornered, with nowhere left to run. But as it stretched one clawed hand toward me, a sudden beam of light sliced through the darkness, pinning the creature in its glare. Squinting against the brightness, I made out two human silhouettes advancing through the trees, flashlight beams sweeping before them. "Ethan!" The achingly welcome voice was Ryan's, edged with worry. "Are you out here? Answer us." Hardly daring to breathe, I risked a glance at the Wendigo and felt a shock. The creature had vanished as if it were never there. Blinking against the residual dazzle of the flashlights, I scanned the tree line, but no trace remained of the nightmarish entity. It was as if the light itself had banished the creature back to whatever dark realm had spawned it. "I'm here," I called, my voice cracking with relief. "Oh, thank God you found me." Ryan and Alex crashed out of the trees, their faces mirrors of deep concern and barely repressed fear. "Dude, we've been searching for hours." Ryan pulled me into a rough embrace as Alex anxiously checked me over for injuries. "What happened to you? We thought we heard screams and, I don't know, other weird sounds out in the woods." I opened my mouth, the full story of my monstrous ordeal rising to my lips. But I hesitated. Already the night's events had taken on a hazy, feverish quality in my mind, as if I had just awoken from a vivid nightmare. Had it really happened at all? Or had the forest's eerie atmosphere and the fireside Wendigo tales simply ignited my overactive imagination? The guys were already on edge. Did I really want to ratchet their anxiety even higher by raving about a pale, demonic creature stalking me through the trees? A creature that had apparently vanished into thin air? I'm not sure," I finally said. "I guess I got lost and panicked. I thought I saw... Well, it doesn't matter. I'm just glad you found me." Ryan and Alex exchanged a wordless look, clearly not fully convinced, but to my relief they didn't push for details. "Come on, let's get you back to camp," Alex said gently, taking my arm to guide me as if he expected me to collapse at any moment. "We'll hike back out to the road at first light and cut this trip short. I think we've all had enough of these woods." I simply nodded, suddenly too exhausted to speak. But as I let my friends lead me back through the trees, I couldn't resist one last look over my shoulder into the shadowed forest behind us. Were those two faintly glowing eyes I glimpsed peering from behind a tangle of trunks? Watching us depart with cold, ageless patience, secure in the knowledge that its forest would always be waiting? Or was it simply a trick of the moonlight and my own strained, overreactive mind? I shuddered and hurried on, eager to put this nightmarish wilderness behind me. But as the trees closed in around us once more, I couldn't shake one last chilling thought. If the Wendigo was real and could truly possess those who encountered it, who was to say the creature hadn't already sunk its claws into my mind? That even now, a seed of insidious madness might be taking root in my psyche, waiting to sprout and grow in the months ahead. What if the true horror was only just beginning? The morning sun slanted through the grimy windows of my cramped studio apartment, catching motes of dust swirling lazily in the wan light. I sat hunched at my tiny kitchen table, staring blearily into a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The blare of morning traffic drifted up from the street below, the city going about its business, blissfully unaware of the shadows that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. It had been 2 months since that nightmarish night in the northern woods. 2 months of jumping at shadows, of lying awake in the dark, listening for the scrape of claws at my door. The first few weeks back had been the hardest. I'd thrown myself into work, trying to lose myself in the comforting banality of spreadsheets and financial reports. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale, gaunt face looming out of the darkness, felt the Wendigo's fetid breath on the back of my neck. I knew Ryan and Alex were worried about me. Our friendship had been strained since the trip. We'd all dealt with the aftermath in our own ways. Alex had channeled his lingering unease into his teaching, becoming a favorite among his students for his intense, immersive lessons. Ryan had thrown himself into his family, taking his daughter on long hikes in the safe, tame woods near their suburban home. And I had simply withdrawn, pulling away from calls and texts, isolating myself in my fortress of solitude. But slowly, gradually, I was putting the pieces of myself back together. Oddly, it was the little moments of connection that helped the most. A brief chat with the barista at my local coffee shop, a shared smile with a stranger on the subway. Each one felt like a tiny victory, a defiant stand against the darkness. Because in the end, that was the Wendigo's true power, I'd come to realize. Not the rending of flesh or gnashing of teeth, but the rending of our humanity. The insidious whisper that we are alone in the dark, that the world is a cold and uncaring place. But it was a lie. There was still light in the world, still warmth and human connection if you knew where to look. I sipped my cold coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. Then I opened my laptop, jaw set with quiet determination. The Wendigo may have sunk its claws into my mind, but I wasn't going to let it win. I would claw my way back to the light one day at a time, starting with settling at least one lingering demon, the looming specter of my finances. I pulled up my online banking portal, steeling myself, and blinked in shock. The balance was far healthier than it had any right to be. Scanning recent transactions, I spotted a deposit from Ryan, then another from Alex. Enough to keep me afloat while I got back on my feet. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I stared at the screen. Even after everything, my friends still had my back. They'd tethered a lifeline to guide me out of the darkness. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I knew I still had a long road ahead of me, that there would still be nights where I awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. But I also knew I had the strength to walk that road. And more importantly, that I wouldn't be walking it alone. The Wendigo had tried its best to unravel the bonds between us, to fray the fabric of our humanity. But it had failed. In the end, it was our connections to each other that would see us through the darkness. The ancient evil in the forest was strong, but it was no match for the light we carried within us. I stood up, mug in hand, and walked to the window, looking out over the bustling city. Somewhere out there, a Wendigo lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. But it would not be me. I had a life to live, and I intended to live it well, to meet my demons head on, strengthened by the knowledge that I was not alone, and bit by bit, to banish the darkness with the light of human connection. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the fight. After all, if there was one thing I'd learned from my night of terror in the forest, it was this. The scariest monsters are the ones we carry within us. But in the end, it is also us who gets to decide how their story ends. I smiled and took a sip of coffee, the morning sun warming my face. Then I turned and walked out my front door, ready to face the day ahead. I never expected to find myself deep in the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, working for a clandestine government agency. But here I was, tramping through the dense undergrowth, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The air was crisp and carried the earthy scent of pine. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the thick canopy overhead. My name is Emily Foster, and I'm from Alaska. I've always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, exploring nature. But I never imagined those interests would lead to a job like this. Desperate times call for desperate measures, though. Drowning in student loan and credit card debt, I needed a lifeline. And one day, out of the blue, I was approached about an opportunity with a secretive branch of the government. They needed people with backcountry skills for special assignments. The pay was great, and it sounded like an adventure. I signed on the dotted line. Now, on my first mission, doubts gnawed at me as I followed my training officer, Sergeant Alvarez, through the trackless woods. Our job was to locate a group of hikers who had disappeared in this remote area a week ago. But something felt off. The hush that hung over the forest was unnatural, foreboding. The hairs on my neck prickled. Alvarez must have sensed my unease. "Keep sharp, eyes peeled," he said in a low voice. "Anything moves, call it out immediately." His hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder. I nodded, hand tightening on my own weapon. They told us to be prepared for anything. Rogue bears, escaped fugitives, drug cartels guarding hidden pot fields. But the veteran soldiers spoke of other threats in hushed whispers when they thought us rookies weren't listening. Things that couldn't possibly be real. As if on cue, a blood-curdling scream rang out from deep in the forest, shattering the eerie silence. Birds exploded from the treetops. Alvarez and I froze, looked at each other. The screaming continued, growing more shrill and agonized. It sounded human, but not quite. A cold dread settled in my gut. "Go, go, go!" Alvarez sprinted toward the sound, dodging between trees, and I followed close on his heels. Branches whipped at my face and undergrowth snatched at my legs. The screaming cut off abruptly, leaving ringing silence in its wake. We stumbled to a halt in a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like an animal attack. Blood splattered the fallen leaves and smeared the nearby tree trunks. Bits of shredded clothing and flesh were strewn about. But something was very wrong with the scene. The torn remnants of clothing were odd, tattered suits and dresses from a bygone era rather than modern outdoor gear. And the remains, they didn't look quite human. Limbs bent at impossible angles, hands tipped with bony claws, grinning skulls that seemed elongated and animal-like. What is this?" I whispered hoarsely, fighting down rising nausea. "Christ," Alvarez hissed. He crouched by a severed arm, still clad in a moldering suit sleeve. "This isn't recent. This is old." A piercing wail sounded behind us. We spun around to see an emaciated, vaguely human figure lurch out of the underbrush, ribs protruding beneath pallid flesh, long arms ending in sharp talons. Lipless jaws parted to emit another unearthly shriek as it bounded toward us. Alvarez opened fire, the shots cracking like thunder in the quiet forest. The thing jerked and stumbled as bullets slammed into it, but it kept coming. I raised my own gun and added to the fusillade. Finally, mercifully, the creature dropped mere feet away, oozing black ichor. We stood over it, panting, pulses pounding. It looked like something out of a nightmare or horror movie, not anything that should exist in the real world. "What is that thing?" I finally managed. "Legend come to life," Alvarez replied grimly. "Every culture has stories. Wendigo, skinwalkers, yeti." He looked at me with haunted eyes. "Congratulations, Private. You just got your first introduction to the real reason this unit exists. To hunt the nightmares that turned out to be real after all." He clicked on his radio. "Sierra Actual. This is Alpha Team. We have contact. Code Black. Repeat code black. As I stared at the twisted remains of the creature, one thing became crystal clear. Those missing hikers weren't lost. They were dead. And now we had to make sure whatever killed them never preyed on anyone else again. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of the horrors lurking in the dark corners of the American wilderness. Horrors we now had to confront head-on. And if we failed, the nightmares would spread. Deep in the lush, temperate rainforests of Oregon, our clandestine unit confronted fresh horrors. The soggy detritus of the forest floor muffled our footsteps as Sergeant Alvarez and I crept through the verdant understory of ferns and moss-clad maples. Mist curled between the trees, turning the woods into a monochromatic watercolor. This time, a U.S. Forest Service ranger had vanished on a routine patrol. With her decades of experience in these woods, it seemed unlikely that she'd simply gotten lost. Our taciturn mission commander, Major Briggs, suspected something more sinister at work. After 3 days of fruitless searching, we finally discovered the ranger's truck. It sat abandoned on an overgrown logging road, doors flung open, windshield starred from the inside with cracks. Rust-colored stains splashed the dashboard and driver's seat. With mounting unease, we followed a trail of disturbed undergrowth and broken branches away from the truck, weapons at the ready. The forest seemed to grow more oppressive the deeper we went, the air heavy and still. I felt unseen eyes boring into my back. "Hold up," Alvarez suddenly whispered, fist raised. "There's something ahead." I squinted through the shifting mist. An ungainly figure shuffled between the trees some 50 meters away, hunched and lurching. It looked vaguely human, but wrong, misshapen. Alvarez keyed his radio. "Sierra, Alpha, we have possible contact with target. Moving to intercept. Over." "Alpha, Sierra. Confirmed. Proceed with caution." Major Briggs's clipped reply crackled back. We began closing the distance, picking our way as quietly as possible over the uneven ground. As we drew nearer, the feeling of unease grew into outright dread. There was something unnatural about the figure, something that set off deep primal alarms in my brain. At 20 meters, it must have finally heard us. The creature whirled with shocking speed to face us, mouth gaping in a silent scream. I recoiled involuntarily. Its face was a ruin of livid fungal growth, shelf-like brackets protruding from skin that looked more vegetal than flesh. Empty sockets seemed to weep with black ichor, and a tangle of root-like tendrils spilled over a shredded ranger uniform. The name tag read, Hawkins, but there was nothing human left. "Contact!" Alvarez yelled, opening fire. The creature bounded toward us with terrifying speed, shrugging off the hail of bullets perforating its body. A tide of lesser horrors boiled out of the mist behind it, chittering, skittering things that looked like nightmarish fusions of insect, fungus, and mammal. Time seemed to dilate as I emptied my rifle into the onrushing horde. Fungal puffballs exploded from shattered exoskeletons and geysers of spores filled the air. Desiccated bodies fell twitching only to be trampled by fresh horrors surging forward. The ranger thing was nearly on us, its fellows swarming close behind. My gun ran dry. Alvarez fumbled for another clip. An insectile horror leapt for his throat, scissored mandibles flashing. He screamed. Then thunder cracked from the mist. The creature's head disintegrated in a spray of chitin and slime. More gunfire roared and the fungal tide recoiled as if slapped. Figures clad head to toe in mottled containment suits emerged from the trees, flamethrowers pumping gouts of cleansing fire. I collapsed against a tree, chest heaving. Alvarez looked shell-shocked. Of Hawkins' body, only smoldering mycelia remained. A containment-suited figure approached us, face obscured behind a reflective visor. "Sergeant Alvarez? Private name?" a muffled voice inquired. "I'm Lieutenant Vega, USS Amriad. Consider yourselves relieved, boys." "What? What was that?" Alvarez croaked out. "Fungal parasite we've designated Ophiocordyceps formicidae. Ant shroom for short," Vega replied grimly. We think it's an emergent superstrain that infects and hijacks multiple hosts. Insect, animal, human. Hawkins must have stumbled across a growth. My mouth felt desert dry. Ant shroom? Parasitic fungi commandeering human bodies? This threat made the Wendigo look tame. Vega clapped our shoulders. There will be a full debrief back at base. For now, just be thankful you survived. Most don't get that lucky their first encounter. As the U. Sam Reed team incinerated the fungi-ravaged parts of the forest, I wondered how many nightmares this unit faced on a regular basis, and how long our luck would hold out. Months passed in a blur of clandestine missions across the country as our team confronted monsters that mortal imaginations had consigned to myth and legend. But a new assignment in the backwoods of Pennsylvania would prove one of our greatest challenges yet. Locals had reported livestock mutilations and glimpses of deformed figures lurking in the forests of the Poconos. The incidents coincided with a spike in missing persons cases. Caught up in the economic downturn, the small towns welcomed the influx of government activity. They had no idea of our unit's true nature or the horrors we hunted. Under the cover of night, Sergeant Alvarez and I crept through dense stands of hemlock and spruce, a gibbous moon peering through the canopy like a baleful eye. The air smelled loamy, but beneath it lay the faintest rotten whiff, like spoiled meat. An hour into our recon, we reached a small clearing in the forest. What we found there froze the blood in my veins. Animal carcasses littered the glade, cattle and sheep ripped open and strewn about, ribbons of flesh trailing from cracked bones. Viscous splatters stained the ground. Most looked days old, crawling with maggots. One appeared more recent. But that wasn't the worst of it. At the center of the charnel display rose a towering arrangement of branches, bones, and flesh. Rotting deer skulls crowned its peak, empty sockets seeming to leer. Tattered skin stretched between ribs and femurs in a grisly webwork. It vaguely resembled the bizarre bone chandelier we'd found in that California mine shaft, clearly crafted by the same minds and hands, or claws. Looks like we found where those missing livestock ended up, Alvarez muttered, face grim. I nodded tightly, unable to tear my gaze from the macabre tower. Some branches looked suspiciously humanoid in shape and size. I flashed to the missing persons reports and felt my gorge rise. A branch snapped in the forest behind us. We spun, rifles snapping up to firing position. Alvarez's flashlight beam penetrated the night, catching a glimpse of sickly pale flesh and far, far too many teeth. Then the beam fell on a tiny, huddled figure crouched behind a stump. A child's tear-streaked face stared back at us, eyes wide with terror. My heart lurched. A little girl, out here? She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. I lowered my gun and stepped forward. "Hey, sweetheart, it's okay," I called softly. "We're here to help. Are you lost?" She remained silent, trembling, gaze flicking to the tree line as if at any moment something terrible might come bursting out. Seeing her fear, I holstered my weapon and knelt, extending a hand. "Don't be scared. We'll get you out of here, okay? Back to your family. I promise." For a moment she hesitated, then started to uncurl from her hiding place. I smiled reassuringly, but as she emerged into the moonlight, I gasped in horror. Blood and worse stained her tattered dress. Clumps of gore crusted her chin and throat. And her teeth. They didn't look right, too pointed, too numerous. I stumbled back as Alvarez yanked me to my feet. "What the hell?" I choked out. She's just a kid." "Not anymore," he replied hoarsely, face ashen. "Whatever's out there, it got to her." As he spoke, more small shapes slipped out of the darkness at the edge of the clearing. Wild eyes and wide, bloody grins flashed in the moonlight. Childish giggles drifted through the night, but there was a manic, feral edge to them. The little girl suddenly lunged, howling, mouth yawning inhumanly wide. Alvarez fired on pure reflex. The shot struck her square in the chest. She crumpled, still snarling around a mouthful of shark-like teeth. The other children, if you could call them that anymore, surged forward, howling. Alvarez and I opened up, the night roaring with muzzle flashes and inhuman shrieks. Bullets tore through small bodies, but they kept coming, seemingly oblivious to pain. One leapt on Alvarez's back, teeth and nails scrabbling for his throat. I wrenched it away and smashed it down, bones snapping beneath my rifle butt. Another latched onto my arm, biting deep. I screamed and flung it away, its skull cracking against a tree trunk. It was over in moments, the sudden silence broken only by our ragged breathing and the soft, wet sounds of the dying. Black blood pooled in the moonlight. Alvarez looked stricken, staring at the broken bodies. They'd been kids once, before something twisted them into monsters. "What the fuck is happening?" he whispered. "Nothing good," I replied shakily, feeling the weight of failures upon failures. All those missing people, warped and turned by something I shuddered to imagine. "We need to call this in, Sarge. This is so much worse than we thought." The wind shifted, bringing a charnel reek with it, and the trees came alive with gleaming eyes and grinning mouths, fresh horrors boiling out of the night. Our unit barely escaped the Pennsylvania woods alive that night, fleeing the gibbering hordes that poured from the forest. Whatever dark force lurked in those hills, it was far stronger and more insidious than anything we'd yet faced. Badly shaken, we licked our wounds and tried to regroup. I stared at the photo in my shaking hands, a treasured snapshot of hometown from better days, before monsters were real and my life had purpose and meaning. What was I doing out here? A pawn in a shadow war that never ended. But the horrors wouldn't let me rest. Weeks later, reports filtered in of strange sightings around an abandoned CCC camp deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest of Wisconsin. Locals spoke of eerie lights flickering in the old stone buildings, inhuman figures skulking in the tree line. The missing person cases mounted. Alvarez slammed a fist on the table as he skimmed the reports. More kids vanished around there, just like in Pennsylvania. I'm seeing a pattern and I don't like it one bit. I knew he still carried the guilt of the innocents we couldn't save. The things we had to do. I felt it gnawing at my own soul. And now it looked to be happening again. Major Briggs was characteristically blunt in our mission briefing. "Whatever is preying on these towns, it's escalating. The powers that be are concerned, and that means we need to get ahead of this. You two have experience with this sort of incursion. Find out what we're dealing with and shut it down." So once more, Alvarez and I found ourselves creeping through moonlit forests, the musty scent of leaf litter thick in the air. The old CCC camp squatted in a clearing ahead, stone walls crumbling beneath cloaking vines and creepers. Shadows pooled thick around the empty windows and doorways. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Alvarez muttered, mirroring my own unease. The forest surrounding the camp felt watchful, heavy with a sense of coiled menace. We took up positions to either side of the dark main entrance, rifles readied. I caught Alvarez's eye, nodded, and we slipped inside, flashlight beams probing the gloom. The interior looked like something out of a slasher flick, peeling lead paint, scattered debris, and strange stains splashed across the walls. A rotten smell hung thick in the air, underlain by a coppery tang I recognized all too well. Blood. The hairs prickled on the back of my neck as we moved deeper into the ruin. Our lights played over a scene of carefully organized chaos. Occult sigils daubed the crumbling walls, interspersed with strange, spiky writing in a language I'd never seen before. Bundles of desiccated herbs and bones hung from the ceiling. In an inner chamber, my flashlight fell across a sight that wrenched the breath from my lungs. A stone altar squatted against the far wall, its slab stained rusty brown. Shackles ending in wicked hooks dangled from the ceiling above it, and huddled on the floor around it. "Oh, God," Alvarez choked. The kids were too late. Small bodies lay crumpled across the room, a dozen at least. Dried blood crusted their torn clothing. Some looked like they'd been gnawed on, flesh worry from limbs and faces. Flies buzzed in thick clouds. I stumbled back, fighting nausea. They'd been tortured, bled, and left for dead. Some of them looked pitifully young, no more than 5 or 6. What kind of monsters could do something like this? From the darkness beyond the altar, a low growl rolled. Slick, glistening shapes detached from the shadows, rising on twisted limbs. Gelatinous flesh undulated, sprouting mouths filled with needle teeth. My mind flashed to the briefing reports and a chill prickled my spine. Deep ones. They'd found their way inland. Alvarez and I opened fire as one, bullets thudding into flabby bodies that rippled and reformed around the impacts. Icarus blood sprayed and the nearest abominations fell writhing, but more boiled out of hidden alcoves and crevices. We fought our way back through the labyrinthine halls, chased by skittering claws and demented piping cries. I felt the clammy flick of a webbed hand and whirled, smashing the twisted thing back with my rifle butt. It gibbered, shark-like teeth gnashing, black eyes alight with malice. And then daylight beckoned, the promise of escape. We burst from the crumbling doorway in a hail of eldritch shrieks, but the horrors kept coming, a tide of writhing, tattered flesh. Alvarez fished a grenade from his vest. "Get clear!" He yanked the pin and lobbed it back through the doorway. A muffled crump shook the stones, followed by keening wails. In the shocking silence that followed, we sprinted for the tree line. Behind us, the camp belched smoke, greasy flames beginning to lick at the eaves. Burning fish frog smell rolled over us and I gagged. At the forest's edge, Alvarez grabbed my arm, pulling me up short. His face looked drawn and ashen. "This is so much worse than we thought. Did you see their altar? The symbols? This wasn't random, it was a ritual. They're trying to bring something through." I swallowed hard, the reality sinking in. The deep ones weren't just isolated monsters. There was an intelligence behind them, an agenda. And those murdered children had been mere sacrifices to fuel their nightmarish plans. We had to get this information back to command immediately, because if the horrors from the deeps gained a foothold in our world, nowhere would be safe. This was only the beginning. Major Briggs listened to our report with a hardening expression, his face etched with grim lines. When we finished, he steepled his fingers, gaze distant. "Deep ones," he said at last, voice heavy. "I'd hoped to never see them this far inland. This is deeply concerning." He turned to face us, eyes intense. "The symbols you described, the ritual killings, they're trying to open a deep gate, a portal to the abyssal plains. And I'm afraid they may have already succeeded." An involuntary shiver ran through me. I'd seen the mind-bending things that lurked in the spaces between worlds, the crawling chaos and forgotten gods. If the deep ones had opened a path for those horrors. Briggs called up a holographic map, zeroing in on a region in the mountains of North Carolina. "We've had strange reports coming out of the Pisgah-Nantahala wilderness. Seismic disturbances, locals ranting about tentacled monstrosities glimpsed in the forests. I fear it may already be a beachhead." He fixed us with a look. "Alvarez, name. You two are the most experienced field agents we have with this particular threat. I need you on the ground immediately to assess the situation and lead the containment efforts. We cannot allow this incursion to spread." The weight of the task settled heavily on my shoulders, but I met the Major's eyes steadily. "We'll get it done, sir. One way or another, we'll drive them back." Alvarez nodded grimly at my side. "Time to finish this, before those abyssal bastards finish us." So once again we readied our gear and our minds to confront the horrors that lurked in the shadow spaces of our world. But this time, I feared that our resolve and our bullets might not be enough. The stakes had never been higher, and the nightmares had never been more real. Under cover of darkness, our helicopters set down in a remote stretch of the Appalachians, rotors whipping the trees. Above, stars glittered cold and sharp in a moonless sky. stepping out into the night, I shivered at a palpable sense of oppressive menace. The air felt greasy, tainted. Our orders were to locate the epicenter of the disturbances and assess the threat level for reinforcements to move in. But as we fanned out into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late, that we were flies blundering into a spider's web. Alvarez took point, picking his way carefully through the undergrowth. I followed close on his heels, senses straining. Around us, the forest lay far too still and silent. No insect chorus, no owl cries. As if all the natural life had fled, or been driven out. And then we smelled it on the wind. The acrid chemical reek of wrongness. It clawed at my sinuses and left an oily coating on my tongue. We exchanged a look, and I saw my own realization mirrored in Alvarez's eyes. That was the stink of an open hell portal, a wound in the skin of reality leaking impossible emanations. Silently, we crept forward, dread pressing in around us. The trees began to thin, and the smell grew stronger, undercut now with the carrion fetor of death and decay. Ahead, the beam of Alvarez's flashlight speared a swirling wall of greasy mist. Eldritch shapes seemed to writhe in its depths. And then the screaming started. Shrill, gurgling cries ripped the night, agony and madness given voice. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, assaulting our ears. My heart kicked into panicked overdrive. I knew those sounds only too well. The shrieks of men and women being flensed of mind and body, being remade. The screams rose to a crescendo, rebounding off the hills, and then cut off abruptly. Echoes rang in the sudden, startling silence. Alvarez and I stood frozen, knuckles white on our guns. From the mist-shrouded gloom, the wet slap of flabby, dragging footsteps, a rank gust of air, heavy with the stench of low tide and putrefaction. The steps drew closer. Shapes moved in the fog. I drew a shaking breath, willing iron into my spine. Beside me, Alvarez braced to fire. And from the billowing banks of mist, our nightmares shambled forth to greet us with grasping arms and shrieking, fang-filled maws. They came at us in a diseased tide, a mass of writhing, Icarus flesh and twisted limbs. Deep ones, their gelatinous bodies distorted into new and terrible configurations. Webbed hands sprouted long, scything claws, arms subdivided into thrashing tentacles. Lamprey mouths yawned in bellies, faces even embedded in broad paddle-like tails. And ripped human bodies bobbed in their midst like obscene driftwood, the ravaged corpses of the swallowed expedition teams. Gutted torsos dangled from the grip of tentacles and claws, entrails trailing like grisly fronds. Pale, contorted faces stared in death, jaws frozen around silent screams. We opened fire, the night erupting into strobing muzzle flashes and deafening thunder. Our bullets plowed through pliant bodies, blasting fist-sized craters that wept black ichor. Alien screams rose in a deranged chorus. But for every abomination that fell twitching, 3 more boiled out of the mist. A massive specimen reared up over Alvarez, body glistening with mucus and eyes alight with malign intelligence. Claws shredded the air a hair's breadth from his face as he blasted it point blank with his shotgun, shearing away a massive gobbet of membranous flesh. It shrieked and fell back, only to be replaced by more grasping horrors. I fought at Alvarez's side, lashing out with gun and boot. My mind flashed to happier times in old, but those memories seemed to fray and splinter with each lurching horror I put down. This war, these nightmares, they hollowed out normalcy and left only the fight. Only the iron taste of blood and cordite, the scream of neurons and sinew pushed past breaking. The tide of horrors seemed endless, an inexorable wall of dank flesh pushing us back step by step. Fetid breath gusted over us, needle teeth gnashed and sought our flesh. We dumped the dregs of our ammunition into the mass to little avail. A searing pain lanced my thigh, a jagged gash weeping scarlet. A creature had slipped past my guard, ripping a line across my skin before I could blast it to rags. My leg buckled and I stumbled. A mossy boulder caught me, the impact driving the air from my lungs. And then they were on me. Suckered appendages coiled around my arms and throat, locking me in an implacable grip. I thrashed and kicked, but more tentacles snaked around my legs, my chest. My lungs burned and vision swam. This was it. This was the end. From my dimming periphery, a great roaring rose, and the pressure suddenly slackened. Great gouts of ichor splattered my face as Alvarez tore into my attackers with an impossibly huge knife, hacking and slashing with the ferocity of a berserker. He'd long since emptied his gun. With a cry of desperate strength, he hauled me up, and we reeled away from the ravening horde. Straining lungs, burning muscles. We crashed heedlessly through the undergrowth as the writhing mass of flesh lurched after us. The tree line drew closer. If we could just reach open ground, call in fire support, maybe we could. The ground fell away before us. A great chasm yawned, overgrown with moss and choked with fog. The seismic disturbances Major Briggs had mentioned. In our frantic flight, we'd run right up to the edge of the abyss. And from that abyss rose a sound that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. A deep, basso groaning, like the drumbeat of some colossal heart. Reality rippled around us, the fundamentals of natural law fraying at the edges. The trees, the stars themselves seemed to flinch and wither. Slowly, terribly, we turned from the precipice to face the onrushing tide of horrors. And rising from their midst, a great figure reared high above the trees. Limbs like sinuous trunks unfolded from its body, itself a quivering mass shot through with luminous veins. Eyes the size of wrecking balls, pools of liquid madness, fixed on us with piercing malevolence. The grating bellow echoed from that titan's throat again, making our very bones shudder in sympathy. Half-formed and indistinct in the fog, it lurched forward on columnar legs, reaching for us with hands that could rend steel and stone. We stared up at the oncoming colossus, the smaller abominations capering in its wake. Empty guns dropped from nerveless fingers. There was nowhere left to run, no way to possibly fight the Titan's crushing might. Our backup would never reach us in time. This was the end of our road, here in a remote forest far from home, facing a monster that couldn't possibly be. I looked to Alvarez, and in his eyes I saw the same grim resolve settle. If we were to die here, we would die fighting. My hand found his, and we gripped tight, united against the end. The Titan loomed, antediluvian and awful, blotting out the sky. Around us the world continued to fray and distort as the very laws of nature unraveled. The abyss behind us groaned again, louder, a sound to shatter sanity. But as I braced for the bone-crushing impact of that great hand, I felt a sudden stillness descend. No fear, no pain. Only the cold clarity of duty and the comforting pressure of Alvarez's fingers twined in mine. We had fought the good fight. Stood against the rising dark longer than any could have asked. And if we couldn't stop the horrors this night, others would follow. I silently commended my spirit to whatever powers watched over those who stood against the abyss. And as the Titan's fist descended, I closed my eyes against the rushing dark and whispered my last prayer. Give us the strength to endure this night. And if the dawn never comes, let others' light shine on. The blow fell like an asteroid strike. Bones splintered, flesh ruptured. In an instant, all light and feeling fled. But as the crushing dark took me, I thought I glimpsed figures emerging from the fog behind the horde. The thump of rotors, shouted orders, muzzle flashes, and the crump of high explosives. Our backup had arrived at last, too late for us. But maybe, just maybe, in time to turn the tide. Consciousness returned slowly, a gradual surfacing from the depths of oblivion. Light pried at my eyelids, and I groaned, trying to turn away. Everything hurt. Stay still. You're safe now. A woman's voice, calm but firm. A hand rested on my shoulder. With effort, I cracked my eyes open. Sterile white walls, blurred shapes moving about. I lay in a hospital bed, swathed in bandages and an IV line trailing from my arm. It all came rushing back. The mission, the horrors in the fog, Alvarez and I making our stand. Alvarez, I croaked through dry, cracked lips. Is he? In the next bed over. Banged up to hell and back like you. But he'll make it. The woman, a nurse, leaned into my field of vision. Stern but kind eyes met mine. You're damn lucky to be alive. Both of you. The medevac team didn't think either of you had a pulse when they reached you. I struggled to process her words. We'd survived the Titan's blow? It seemed impossible, but the aches racking my body said otherwise. The nurse busied herself checking my vitals, making notes on a chart. Frankly, it's a miracle you boys held out as long as you did against those things. Bought just enough time for reinforcements to drop on that portal and collapse it with you two still breathing. But it was a close run thing. I looked over to where Alvarez lay, still and pale against white sheets. Resolve settled in my chest, bringing with it a cold, still sort of calm. We'd faced the worst horrors imaginable, looked into the abyss and spat defiance with our last breath. But the fight wasn't over. The deep ones had punched through once. They'd do it again. And we had to be there to stop them, no matter the cost. I laid my head back, exhaustion dragging at me. We'd stood at the crumbling edge of reason and reality, stared down forces that could unravel both. Impossible as it seemed, we'd live to fight another day. But I knew, bone deep and certain, that our trials were far from over. The battle against the dark was only beginning. More portals would open, more abominations come crawling through. The deep ones, and worse things beside. As I slipped back toward unconsciousness, one thought crystallized in my mind, hard as diamond and sharp as a blade. For as long as I drew breath, I would stand against the rising tide of nightmares. No matter how dark the night grew, no matter what clawed its way out of the abyss, I would be there to meet it, to drive it back or die trying. Because in a world where the monsters under the bed turned out to be real, there was no other choice. We happy few, we band of brothers, we who fought the dying of the light, we were all that held the line. The nurse's voice echoed from 1,000 miles away. Rest now. You've earned it. The world will still be here when you wake up. The world, I rasped, but not unchanged. I held that thought as I spiraled back down into the waiting dark. Not unchanged, but still here, still fighting. And that would have to be enough. I knelt by the small flower-strewn grave, fingers tracing the words carved into the headstone. So many names, etched in unyielding granite. The fallen from our unnamed war, those lost to the hungry dark. Months had passed since that last desperate battle in the North Carolina woods. Months of recovery, of rebuilding. The doctors told me I shouldn't have survived, much less walk again. But I had promises to keep. Overhead, the sky hung gray and heavy. It seemed always on the verge of rain these days, the world grown dim. Reports trickled in from other teams, other operations. More portals, more abominations spewing forth. We were all that stood against the flood. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind me. A hand, strong and scarred, settled on my shoulder. I didn't need to look to know it was Alvarez. Command just called, he said quietly. They need us in Arizona. Possible deep one nest in the desert. Ritual killings. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that duty settle across my shoulders once more. How long do we have? Transport's spinning up now. I heard the grim smile in his voice. No rest for the wicked, yeah? No rest, I agreed. With a final touch to the memorial, I levered myself to my feet. The aches and pains were fewer every day, the scars fading. But some wounds would never fully heal. I turned to face my friend, my brother in arms. In his eyes, I saw my own resolve. tempered in the flames of all we'd endured, all we'd lost. "One last dance, then," I said. "Once more unto the breach." "Once more," he nodded. "And then perhaps, one day, peace." I clasped his shoulder, a benediction and a promise. "Peace," I echoed. "When the task is done. When the dawn comes." He returned my grip fiercely. "When the dawn comes," he agreed. And together we turned to walk back to the waiting world. To the duty that called us, the battle that never ended. For we were the watchmen on the walls, the line against the dark. We who fought monsters, lest we become them. We who stood, that others might sleep safe a while. It was a burden, and an honor, and a sacred charge, and one we would never lay down, so long as strength and breath endured. We were headed back into the abyss, back to the teeth and the claws and the madness that lurked in the spaces between. But we did not go alone, and we did not go in fear, for ours was the fury, ours was the duty, ours was the dawn. The boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan stretched endlessly before Cameron Walsh as he adjusted his heavy backpack. 34 years old and desperate for solitude after his messy divorce, he'd chosen this remote section of Prince Albert National Park for its isolation and pristine wilderness. No cell service, no tourists, just the ancient pines and the promise of peace. 2 weeks alone. Cam muttered to himself as he consulted his topographical map. 2 weeks to clear my head. The late September air carried the first whispers of autumn, crisp and clean. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with each breeze. Despite the serenity, something felt different. In his 15 years of solo backpacking, Cam had developed what his friends called a wilderness intuition. Today, that intuition prickled uncomfortably at the back of his neck. The trail had disappeared nearly 2 hours ago. Now he navigated by compass and map alone, pushing deeper into territory few hikers ever ventured. According to his research, the nearest human dwelling was over 30 miles south. He was utterly alone, or should have been. The first anomaly came that afternoon. While setting up camp near a small stream, Cam discovered unusually large tracks in the soft mud of the bank. Too large for a black bear, too wide for a moose. The impressions were deep, suggesting significant weight, with 5 distinct toe marks at the front of each print. "What the hell made these?" he whispered, crouching to examine them. The prints were fresh, perhaps only hours old. As daylight faded, Cam built his fire larger than usual, the flames casting long shadows among the trees. Something about those tracks had disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He'd heard stories, of course, every serious backpacker had. Tales whispered by locals in small-town diners, posts on obscure wilderness forums about encounters in remote forests like this one. Just bears, he assured himself as he prepared his freeze-dried dinner. Weird prints, but definitely bear. The forest grew unnaturally quiet as darkness fell. No chirping insects, no rustling nocturnal creatures. Just silence broken only by the occasional crack of his campfire. At 2:17 a.m., Cam jolted awake in his tent. He hadn't dreamed. Something had woken him. He lay perfectly still, listening. Then he heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling his campsite. Slow, methodical. The sound of something large moving with surprising stealth. And underneath that sound, barely perceptible, breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that didn't belong to any animal Cam recognized. Morning revealed nothing. No prints, no disturbed gear. Yet Cam couldn't shake the certainty that something had visited his camp. He packed quickly, eager to move deeper into the wilderness where he'd planned to establish his main base camp near Alpine Lake. The day's hike took him through increasingly dense forest. Several times he paused, certain he'd glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision. just flashes of something large and dark slipping between distant trees. But each time he turned, nothing was there. Getting jumpy already, he chided himself. Day 2 and already seeing things. By mid-afternoon, he reached his destination. Alpine Lake stretched before him, its surface reflecting the surrounding pines and distant mountains. It was perfect, secluded, beautiful, with fresh water and natural shelter provided by a small rocky overhang. As he set up his base camp, Cam noticed broken branches high in the surrounding trees, 15 feet up or higher. Too high for a bear. The breaks appeared fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and unwithered. Despite his growing unease, he forced himself to follow his routine, setting up his tent, collecting firewood, filtering water from the lake. Structure and logic were his anchors. There were rational explanations for everything he'd observed. That night, he recorded his thoughts in his journal. Day 2, Alpine Lake. Something's off about these woods. Tracks too big for known wildlife. Breaking branches too high for bears. Keep hearing movement just beyond visual range. Most disturbing is the feeling of being watched constantly. We'll reassess tomorrow if conditions continue. He'd just closed his journal when he heard it. A long, mournful sound somewhere between a howl and a deep, resonant whoop that echoed across the lake. It repeated 3 times, each call lasting nearly 10 seconds. The sound didn't match any animal Cam knew, and he'd studied wilderness survival extensively. More unsettling was what happened next. From the distant hills came responses. 2 distinct calls answering the first. Whatever had made that sound wasn't alone. Cam added more wood to his fire and retrieved his hunting knife from his pack. He didn't own a gun, had never felt the need for one until this moment. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and plagued by dreams of being pursued through endless trees by something he couldn't quite see. He woke at dawn to find his carefully stacked firewood scattered and, most alarmingly, his food bag missing from where he'd hung it 15 feet high between 2 pines. "This isn't happening," Cam muttered as he surveyed his campsite. The missing food was a serious problem. He had emergency rations in his pack, enough for maybe 3 days, but not the 2 weeks he'd planned. He would need to either forage extensively or cut his trip short. But it was the method of theft that truly unnerved him. The rope holding his food bag hadn't been cut. It had been untied and carefully rehung. Empty. Whatever took his supplies had the dexterity to untie complex knots. As he contemplated his options, he noticed something new. A crude arrangement of stones on the lakeshore that hadn't been there the previous evening. 12 rocks placed in a rough circle with 3 larger stones in the center. It looked deliberately placed. A message or warning of some kind. Time to go, Cam decided, his heart pounding. This isn't wildlife. This is something else. He began packing hastily, but stopped when he realized a critical problem. He wasn't entirely sure which direction he'd come from. His detailed topographical map was in his food bag, now gone. His backup compass showed north, but without landmarks or his map, finding the trail back would be challenging. Focus, he told himself. South and slightly east. Follow the drainage. You'll hit the marked trail eventually. By noon, Cam was pushing through dense underbrush, keeping the sun on his left as he moved what he hoped was south. The forest seemed to have changed overnight. Trails he thought he recognized led nowhere. Landmarks appeared unfamiliar. Several times he discovered those same large humanoid tracks, now seemingly fresh. "Hello?" he called out, wondering if perhaps other hikers were playing an elaborate prank. "Is someone there?" His voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest. The only response was an unnatural silence, the birds and insects falling quiet as his voice faded. That's when he spotted it. Standing motionless between 2 distant trees was a figure, tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark hair or fur. Though mostly obscured by foliage, its outline was unmistakably bipedal. It made no sound, no movement. Just watched. Cam froze, his breath catching. For nearly a minute, neither moved. Then slowly, the figure stepped backward, maintaining eye contact until it disappeared into the shadows of the forest. With hands shaking violently, Cam pulled out his phone to take a photo, forgetting momentarily it had died days ago. Cursing, he shoved it back in his pocket and resumed walking, now at a much faster pace. By late afternoon, he realized he was lost. The sun was getting low, and he'd been walking for hours with no sign of the trail. Worse, he'd begun to suspect he was being herded, subtly guided away from certain areas by strategically placed broken branches and stone arrangements that appeared with increasing frequency. With no choice but to make camp again, he selected a small clearing, gathering what little deadwood he could find. The fire he built was smaller than he'd like, but it would have to do. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds, branches breaking in the distance, heavy footfalls that stopped and started, and most disturbing, what sounded like low, murmuring voices just beyond the firelight. At some point during that endless night, as Cam huddled by his dwindling fire, the stalking became overt. They, for he was now certain there were at least 3, began circling his camp. Keeping to the shadows, they moved with a coordination that suggested intelligence and purpose. Occasionally, one would strike a tree trunk powerfully, creating a booming sound that reverberated through the forest. Another would answer from a different direction. They were communicating, coordinating. "I'm not here to harm anything," Cam called out, his voice cracking. "I'm just passing through." His words were met with sudden, complete silence, then a barrage of wood knocks erupting from all directions, so loud and numerous he covered his ears. In the brief illumination of his headlamp, he caught glimpses, massive, fur-covered limbs, glinting, reflective eyes. Once a full silhouette, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, standing upright on 2 legs at the edge of the darkness. Near dawn, exhausted and terrified, Cam made a decision. He would leave everything except water and essential survival gear. Moving light and fast, he might cover enough ground to reach civilization. As the first gray light filtered through the trees, he prepared to implement his plan, only to discover his boots were missing. They'd been taken silently from where he'd left them beside his sleeping bag. A primitive message: "You're not going anywhere." From a nearby ridge came that same haunting call he'd heard the first night, a sound that raised goosebumps across his entire body. Using strips torn from his backpack, Cam bound extra socks around his feet, a poor substitute for hiking boots, but they would have to do. With his knife in hand and emergency rations stuffed in his pockets, he abandoned his camp and began moving quickly downhill, following a small stream that had to eventually lead to lower elevations and possibly people. The pursuit began almost immediately. Heavy crashes through the underbrush behind him, guttural vocalizations that couldn't be mistaken for any known animal. They weren't hiding anymore. They were actively chasing. Cam ran, scrambling over fallen logs and through shallow ravines, his makeshift footwear quickly shredding on the rough terrain. His lungs burned, and his feet began bleeding, but terror drove him forward. When he reached a steep embankment above a rocky creek bed, he lost his footing. The fall was only about 15 feet, but he landed badly, feeling something snap in his ankle. White-hot pain shot up his leg as he tried to stand. Hobbling now, he managed another quarter-mile before accepting the inevitable. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them. His only hope was somehow making peace, or hiding well enough to escape detection. Selecting a dense thicket, he crawled inside, covering himself with fallen leaves and forest debris. And there, curled in a fetal position with his useless knife clutched to his chest, Cameron Walsh waited for whatever would come next. Night fell. Cam's broken ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, throbbing in time with his racing heart. From his hiding place, he watched as bobbing lights appeared in the distance, flashlights moving in a coordinated search pattern. "Here! Over here!" he shouted, certain these must be park rangers or rescue personnel. The lights immediately converged on his location, Relief flooded through him, until the flashlight beams revealed their holders. They weren't human. 3 massive figures surrounded his hiding place. In the harsh illumination, he could now see them clearly. 8 feet tall at minimum, powerfully built, covered in matted reddish-brown hair. Their faces were startlingly expressive, almost human-like but with pronounced brow ridges and wide, flat noses. Most disturbing were their eyes, dark and unmistakably intelligent. They carried his flashlights, tools they'd clearly figured out how to use. The largest of the 3 crouched down, its face now just feet from Cam's. Its breath smelled of raw meat and wild herbs. For endless seconds they stared at each other. Then, with surprising gentleness, the creature reached out and touched Cam's injured ankle. He flinched but didn't pull away. What happened next defied everything Cam thought he knew about the natural world. The 3 beings worked together with obvious purpose. The largest lifted him carefully, cradling him like a child, while the others gathered materials, branches, moss, what looked like medicinal plants. They carried him to a cave he hadn't noticed before, its entrance hidden behind a natural formation of fallen trees. Inside, a fire already burned in a well-established pit. Other creatures, smaller ones, possibly juveniles, moved back as he was brought in and placed on a bed of soft pine boughs. One applied a poultice of chewed plants to his ankle, while another offered him what appeared to be dried meat and berries. Despite his fear, hunger overtook him, and he ate. For 3 days, they kept him in that cave. They treated his injury, brought him food and clean water, but never allowed him to leave. They communicated among themselves with an elaborate system of vocalizations, gestures, and facial expressions that suggested a complex language. On the 4th day, the largest one, whom Cam had begun thinking of as the leader, gestured for him to follow. His ankle, while not healed, had improved enough for him to walk with the help of a makeshift staff they'd provided. They led him through the forest, traveling primarily at night. The journey took 2 more days, during which Cam observed their social structure, their hunting techniques, their obvious intelligence. They weren't animals, but they weren't human either. They existed in some extraordinary middle ground science hadn't acknowledged. Finally, they stopped. Through a break in the trees, Cam could see distant lights, a small town or outpost. The leader made a pushing motion toward the lights, then a sweeping gesture back toward the forest. The message was clear: go there, don't come back. As dawn approached, they disappeared silently into the trees, leaving him alone at the forest's edge. He found himself on a marked hiking trail with a signpost indicating the ranger station was just 2 miles ahead. Before beginning that final leg of his journey, Cam turned back toward the darkened forest. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed eyes watching from the shadows, that same intelligent gaze that had both terrified and fascinated him. "I understand," he said quietly. "Your secret is safe." Then he turned and limped toward civilization, already composing in his mind the story he would tell. A simple tale of getting lost, injuring himself, and surviving on his emergency supplies until finding the trail again. The truth would remain in the forest, where it belonged.